and I maintain that there is nothing in the Quran and Sunnah that explicitly allows you to rape a concubine, right? There's nothing that commands it or recommends it or even permits it. And the jurists, when they were formulating rules, they formulated rules on practical matters. They didn't do hypothetical matters. Right. And the fact that nobody ruled on it for hundreds of years, I think, is evidence that they just weren't doing that. You know, they had a concept of manhood that precluded them from doing that. They were trying to live up to the ideals of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so they just weren't engaging in that kind of behavior. And that's why it just doesn't appear in the legal text, because that just was not a common occurrence, and nobody asked about it, so nobody made a ruling about it. And so that's my opinion for why there's a silence for this period of time on this particular issue. So that's why the consent for concubines doesn't exist in the early literature. But we do know that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he prohibited forced prostitution. So like I said, a man couldn't have a concubine and then go share her with a bunch of different people. You know, then he would be a pimp, right? And he's forcing her to do all these things. That is illegal. That comes from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself. I believe I cited that one. And to be fair, I just read not long ago that there are, in fact, some jurists who did allow that as a concession, okay? But Ibn al-Qayyim, the classical scholar, he mentioned that as a false and invalid opinion. So, you know, if you go into the juristic heritage, you are probably find some terrible things out there, right? But those aren't, you know, a lot of those aren't really the mainstay of the scholars that we rely upon today, who had these kind of bad opinions like that. Then there's this interesting hadith and incident where Abu Umama, the companion, may Allah be pleased with him, he was asked about a wife who owned a female maidservant, right? And then she gave him to her husband, and he had sexual relationships with her. And then the ruling that he basically said this was adultery, right? Wow. So even if that throws that other bad opinion we just mentioned out the window, right? Because there's this hadith about it. So that, you know, even the wife, she couldn't give her female maidservant to her husband to have sex with. I mean, that was not allowed. And Ibn al-Qayyim, he mentions this incident, and I think he has the most explicit statement about this issue that I have found, right? And it comes at the end of the article, but I think it really concludes it very well. So he talked about like this this female slave who belongs to a woman, was given to the husband, and the husband had relationships with her, and he forced himself onto. He said that this is ikraha al-wat. This is compulsion to intercourse. He didn't say compulsion to adultery. He said compulsion to intercourse, and he said it is muthla, which is a strong word meaning like torture, a type of punishment. So the forcing of this concubine to have intercourse was a punishable crime, and he said it would be punishable by the ruler. So I think, and it's interesting because he said ikraha ala al-wat, not ikraha ala zina, which is what rape would normally have, but ikraha into intercourse, right? And he described it as a serious crime. So there's that, and I think that speaks most clearly to the issue of raping the concubines, like that. You know, it's like a form of torture. It's a form of punishment. You know, and it's a form of harm, and so it's forbidden. I mean, there's no question about it. A couple of points. We're getting to the end here, but a couple of points is that the Quran and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he encouraged slaves to get married. So he encouraged Muslims to marry slave women and slave men to get married. There was a discussion about whether is it suitable for a free person to marry a slave. That's, fuqaha talked about that. But the Quran does say it encourages slaves to get married. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a maid servant named Safiya, and he freed her and he married her. So he encouraged that himself, and then he practiced that himself. And he also said in another hadith that I mentioned in the article that if there's a man who has a maid servant, so he has a concubine, and he raises her, he educates her, he treats her in the best manner, and then he frees her, he will have a double reward. So he'll have the reward for treating her well, and then he will have the reward for marrying her. So again, that's strong encouragement for the female maidservants to have their status in society elevated through marriage, to be freed and then to be married, right? And so that's the trajectory of where we would want to go. Like if you're following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then you would treat your servants well. And then if they're females, you would free them and marry them, because he himself did that, right? Mm-hmm. And if there was if a master or custodian had a concubine with whom he had a relationship, and then she married another man, then he can no longer have sexual relations with her, right? Because that would be as if she married a different person, right? So if the concubine goes and marries another man, then the person who had her under his custodianship to begin with can no longer have relationship with her. And so that's another analogy that we can make to marriage, that these were these concubine relationships, they're not exactly equal to marriage, but they're like marriage in many, many respects, and that they're exclusive relationships. There's some rights involved. You're not allowed to harm your wife. You're not allowed to harm your concubine. And as a side point, since I'll just mention here about marital rape, because this would come up, that marital rape wasn't a legal. It's only been a legal category for the last 100 years or so. It's also something very new. So obviously, classical Islamic law doesn't talk about it. Because you're allowed to have sex with your wife. And so how is that rape? Well, we wouldn't call it marital rape. We would call it abuse and harm. You're not allowed to abuse and harm your wife. And if you do that, she can go to the judge and get a divorce. Yeah. Right. So
it's covered in the law. It's just a different language is used. That's all.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a different character altogether. And then finally, I put this at the end. The hadith at the end, which I think kind of ties it all together very well, is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you have a servant who is not suitable for you, then sell him or her to someone else, and do not torture the creation of Allah. So he said that. So what that means is if you have a concubine, you can't have a good relationship with her, go give her to somebody else and don't torture her. So he said very explicitly, do not torture your servants, right? And as Ibn al-Qayyim said, forcing someone to commit intercourse against their will is a type of torture. Muthla, different word, but same idea altogether.